Ballad of the Tempest, a poem analysis by Jonathan Middleman, and this poem was written by James T. Fields. James T. Fields' early life and legacy. He was born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on December 31st, 1817. His father had died before James turned 3, which meant that he and his brother were raised by their mother. Fields was primarily a publisher and a writer. However, his long list of poems were published in a large book called The Ballads of Verses. Ballads of the Tempest was published in 1849, which makes it fall under the Romanticism literary device. This book was written in the 1880s, just 1 year prior to his death in 1881. He would die at the age of 63, which is still fairly old for that time period. For then he lived a long life. Now I'm going to read the poem. We were crowded in a cabin. Not a soul would dare to sleep. It was midnight on the waters, and the storm was on the deep. An important thing to note is the words sleep and deep were highlighted because the poet followed the structure in each of the stanzas. The poet uses the rhymes between those words, sleep and deep, to keep the flow of the poem going. In this case, the rhymes are adding a musical flow to the poem, which makes people want to keep reading. The poet says, not a soul would dare to sleep. He's actively using a metaphor to get across to people that they were scared. Later on in the stanza, he discussed the poor conditions of the storm, how even together, crowded, they were still too afraid to sleep. The dangers of the oceans are what made them all afraid to sleep. 'Tis a fearful thing in the winter to be shattered by the blast, and to hear the rattling trumpet thunder, cast away the mast. The poet is using the words blast and mast to keep the flow of the poem going. Once again, the rhythms are being used to keep the musical flow, and in line 2, the poem is using a hyperbole to exaggerate the effect of the waves. The poet is not actually going to be shattered, but it will be damaged because of the waves. And he is using the hyperbole to emphasize the dangers that are happening in this tempest. And in line 3-4, the poet is having the trumpet make thunderous noises. Trumpets can't actually thunder. In this case, using onomatopoeia. The onomatopoeia is being used to exaggerate the situation, what's happening. Stanza 3. We shuddered there in silence, for the stoutest held his breath, while the hungry sea was roaring, and the breakers talked with death. The poet is again using a rhyme to keep the musical flow. Those words are breath and death, and that is what the structure of the poem is, to consistently have lines 2 and 4 have rhymes. What's interesting is that the people on the ship were silently sitting, while the sea did the opposite. As opposed to being quiet, it was roaring. In line 2, the stoutest holding his breath. However, it is impossible to hold your breath for a long time, which means that this is an exaggeration, also known as a hyperbole. And in line 3, the author is using onomatopoeia once again to get the message across of how dangerous the sea really is. The sea can't actually roar, but the waves made by it can be extremely loud. Stanza 4. As thus we sat in darkness, each one busy with his prayers. We are lost, the captain shouted as he staggered down the stairs. The poet has switched things up in the stanza, and as opposed to using a rhyme, he's choosing to not have it. The reason for this is that the poet is wanting to put an emphasis on what the captain is actually saying. During line 3, the captain has given up hope and all seems to be lost. When he says that we are lost, he's saying this both in a literal sense, that because they are lost in the ocean, and because they might be dead, and as in like lost from their lives. And the captain thinks that they have no way to escape the dangerous ocean, but will soon learn that things may change and turn around for him. Stanza 5. But his little daughter whispered as she took his icy hand, isn't God upon the ocean just the same as on the land? The poet has returned to his previous uses of rhymes and had the words hand and land rhyme in lines 2 and 4. Those words are actually highlighted. The use of these rhymes is simply to keep the flow of the story and to ensure that the structure of the poem remains consistent. In line 2, it is said that the daughter is taking his icy hand. However, she's not actually taking it, but rather holding it. This is an exaggeration, and the poet is using this to bolster the connection between the daughter and the captain, since they are related. The daughter believes in God and hopes that God will save them from the horrible situation in the ocean. And the God believes that God is present both in land and the ocean, which is why she says, isn't God upon the ocean just the same as on the land? The daughter was taught to be religious, and the poet is similarly religious, and he's reflecting his personal beliefs in the poem in this moment. Stanza 6. When we kissed the little maiden and we spake in better cheer, we anchored safe in harbor when the morn was shining clear. Once again, the author is following the same pattern of rhymes by ending the 2nd and 4th lines with rhyming words. The 2 words rhyming are cheer and clear, and the 3rd line in the author is using a metaphor when talking about anchoring at the sea, safe harbor. What is really happening is the boat is being anchored, not them. The use of this piece finger language to just add to the flow of the poem and allow for better imagery, specifically so that people can imagine what's actually happening in this moment. Rhythms and rhymes. The poem follows a B, C, B D-E-F-E rhyme scheme. Although this can be tough to understand, all it means is that the second and fourth lines of each stanza had a rhyme at the end of it. As you can notice, during the entire time when I was reading the poem, there were orange highlights for the words that had rhymes. The only thing that did not have this line was the poem highlighted in gray. That one did not follow this phenomenon. The name for the phenomenon where the second and fourth lines rhyme is called a near rhyme. And this entire poem followed that sort of near rhyme structure. What type of poem is this? The poem is a lento. As explained previously, it means that the second and fourth lines are always rhyming, and the poem is a bit different though, because it is an outlier. That doesn't change the type of poem it is. It is still the same thing, just has an outlier, which is caused by the fourth stanza, highlighted in gray. The message and theme, what actually happened. What happened in this poem was that a group of people were out in the sea during a serious storm. Everyone thought that death was near, but in life, there's always a chance of people surviving. The message or the theme is to not give up hope, because even when all seems lost, there's always a chance, and that chance is what keeps people going in their journey. The tone throughout the story was a very emotional and dramatic one. So for example, when the author and the poet said, "Not a soul would dare to sleep. Breakers talked with death. We are lost. We spake in better cheer." Each stanza had a very emotional and dramatic scenes like this one. And I listed them because I believe they are prime examples of why the tone is emotional. They were freaking out in these moments, that they were lost. They were cheering. They were doing all these things, and they're all emotional. And the poem was written in the 1800s. And that was a time where traveling by boat was considered extremely dangerous. And this was also a time period where religion was believed in more deeply than now. As a result, the poet wrote this poem in a way to highlight the dangers of the ocean, as well as discussing the importance of religion and God. So this literary movement used in this poem was Romanticism. And this movement, firstly, lines up with the proper years of Romanticism, since it was written between the years 1790 and 1850. And this poem was written in 1849, just under. And this poem also deeply describes the events of what's actually taking place and emphasizes the imagination and aesthetic by requiring the reader to imagine what's actually happening throughout the entire poem. And I'd like to thank you all for listening, and goodbye.